Alright, let's do a quick recap of how to set up a turntable, including batch rendering, and then at the very end, what to look out for and what to do when you bring it into After Effects. So let's just look at the scene right away. And what I have, I just picked a few random items. I don't have the greatest, a lot of them are just placeholder textures still and whatnot, but yours should be finished. What I did is I have all my stuff in a group, again, because it's always good to stay organized even if you're not sure if you're going to need it. So I have this group here that I can move my stuff around. I have my base here, which is a separate object. And right now I'm just looking through the perspective camera, but I might create a new camera just for the purpose of lining up my turntable shot. And I mean, it's always a good idea to create a new camera anyway, just because the perspective camera should typically be left alone, so that you don't accidentally mess it up or anything. You don't really want to animate on it too much. And one of the other reasons that we can use make a new camera is that then I could technically go to and split my oops, that's the orthographic view. I could split my viewport into two angles and actually look in my perspective camera and see my new camera. So here's the new camera I just made over here, which I should probably rename to like render cam or something like that, or turntable cam. But the reason that I want to do this is so that if I need to line up my shot, I can do it a little bit more precisely because I can move it around from an impartial third-party perspective. Another thing I might do here is just hit F, select this turntable base, and hit F in this camera on the left here, and kind of get that centered. And then in this one, I can kind of just move it around after it's already been centered. And I want to find a pretty good place to put this, and I might increase my focal length a little bit. You don't have to increase your focal length. You could try reducing your focal length or whatever you feels nice. Oh, whatever you think feels nice. But check this out. So if you look really close, I can kind of check the bottom right and left-hand corners of my shot and see that it's almost the exact same distance between the base and the edge of the frame there, which means that I probably have a pretty centered camera right now. And of course, so I don't really want to move it left or right or in X. If we're talking proper CG terms, I might want to kind of angle it a little bit differently because that will affect how my turntable looks. But otherwise, I'm not gonna. I want to use my best judgment and get this looking good, not terrible, based off of good proportions and composition and whatnot. But I'm not going to go crazy with it. As far as lighting goes, obviously you can see I have a dome light in here with an image on it. And, I played around with the light settings. I made the image a little bit brighter. But you guys, that's not what this video is about, so you guys can play around with that. I have a directional light where I increased the angle of the light in the Arnold settings to make it a little bit less harsh and increase the exposure. And then I also have this back here, which is just a very intense Arnold area light, and that's just providing some backlighting. Even though this will be a 360 render, I still want to have basic three-point lighting concepts in my scene, even though we're looking from multiple angles. Alright, so I'm going to save, and one thing that's worth noting before we jump ahead is that I don't have I'm just using my own version of Maya, and I don't have a paid version of Arnold, so I'm not going to be able to oh shit, you know what? I didn't make the turntable yet. Alright, so we already went over this in class, but just as a recap, there's a few different things you could do. One would be that if you wanted to, you could have everything parented to your base, and then have animate your base turning around. So I could select my base, set a key on my rotate Y, and then 240 frames later, since I'm going to make this basically 10 seconds, I could type in 360 degrees and set another keyframe And that could be one way that you could animate your turntable, if that speaks to you. Just keep in mind that the lighting will kind of like change across the surface of your model while this is happening. I could actually try turning on my light preview here and kind of show you what I mean by that. So if you notice the shadows are always going to be rotating, and the light is going to be moving across the surface of your objects, and that could be something that you want your thing to look like, especially if you don't have too intense shadows on your in your scene. Then that might not be a big deal. But it's still going to get the same ultimate effect, which is going to be seeing a 360 looping view of your objects. So I'm going to backtrack. I'm just going to hit right-click and say break connections on that so that I get rid of the animation. And instead what I'm going to do is the same thing I did in class, which is I'm going to be in the camera I want to start from. So I'm in my render cam. I'm going to select the object I want to like center my view on, which is the base. That makes it easier if you just center on the base rather than one of the objects in your shot. And then change your menu set to animation and go to visualize, create turntable. And this you do have to be careful because it doesn't automatically detect how many frames are in your timeline. It's a number that you type in. So I want 240 frames, it's 10 seconds. If you want yours to be a little bit longer, that's fine. But now it's created this new group with a turntable camera in it, and that's actually the camera we're probably in. It kind of automatically puts you in that camera. So yeah, we're in turntable camera 1. And now we can see that I already get some free animation. Not that the animation is anything crazy, but because I lined up my camera beforehand and because I centered on the right object, which was in this case my base plate, I basically get a nice looking turntable for free without having to do much. So this turntable camera is actually what we're going to want to render from. So I might even rename this like this is render cam now, and this one can just be like comp cam or something for composition, and that way I always know which one I'm going to be rendering from. There's a plane going by right now. So either way, and then real quick, I'm gonna fix my slow in and slow out on this because I don't really like that. If this was a longer turntable, then maybe the ease in and ease out, or slow in and slow out, wouldn't be that jarring. But since this is only 10 seconds, I'm going to open my graph editor and I'm going to select the group that Maya created for me on top of my render cam, and that is going to be what's animated. And here I'm simply just going to go up here and set this to linear tangent, so it will make that spline curve completely straight. Obviously, if you haven't animated before, then we will discuss all of the ins and outs of the graph editor and whatnot in Animation 1. But for now, we can do this. And yeah, and that'd be the same thing you do if you were animating your objects turning. You just do that, but on whatever thing you have animated. So if you keyed your base plate, that would be what you'd select and go into the graph editor to fix. All right, so just rendering stuff. So I'm assuming everyone's gonna be using Arnold. I might reload the default settings here. And if I don't know if anybody's done that before, but if you ever feel like you messed up your settings or something, you can always go to presets, load default settings. So I want this to be name_number.extension, so it turns into animation. You do want to increase frame padding, because if you look up here where my mouse is, your numbers are just going to be underscore and then directly a number. And you do want to have a little bit of padding under there so that frame 1 and frame 10 aren't right next to each other in your file browser. And then here I'll type in frame 1 to 239. I'm not going to render frame 240 because, as we discussed in class, and you guys already know you want to skip the last frame if it's a perfect loop so that it doesn't have an extra frame. Now you guys would probably want to make yours bigger, 720 or 1080, but I'm just going to leave mine at 540 for the sake of rendering this. Obviously I'm not going to render in the video, I'm going to skip ahead to after I've rendered this. And then the rest of this is up to you. So clearly, you know, you're probably going to have to play, you know, decide, if anything, just increase your camera sampling and nothing else. But depending on what you have in your scene, what type of materials you have and whatnot, you may need to increase these as well. And the ray depth if you have like glass, but that's only sometimes. Yeah, otherwise I think I'm gonna leave it like that. And one thing that I didn't mention, but I did mention in class, is just real quick before I render, I did turn my dome light. I went down to the visibility settings and I turned camera visibility off because I don't actually want this picture in the background, because it's going to make people dizzy, because it's going to look like we're on like a merry-go-round or something spinning really fast, because the background is going to be rotating faster than the objects that we're looking at. So of course you always want to do a test render before you actually render. So I'm going to check, and that's the wrong camera, but I'm going to check and make sure that that is actually working. So making sure that I don't see my my image in the background, making sure that everything looks good. Obviously this stuff kind of goes without saying. This is stuff that you'll have to do before you render anything. But just a reminder, and I also wanted to check to make sure mine worked, because you never don't want to be checking this stuff. Alright, so now I'm pretty much ready to render. And now, if you're in the lab computers, then you should just be able to change your menu type to rendering and check render and then find batch render. Now if I try to click batch render, it's going to render, but it's going to have a watermark, which I don't really want. So, but this is what it looks like when you're batch rendering. So it says, if I just go down here and open my script editor, it'll say rendering with Arnold renderer ... and then proceed to start rendering, and this is literally a percentage of how finished each image is. Now I actually don't want to keep rendering this because it's gonna have a watermark on it, and I don't want to waste time. So I'm going to say render cancel batch render, and it should hopefully stop. Sometimes in the past I've had issues where it would say that it stopped, but then if I looked at my task manager, it would still be rendering. So hopefully that actually stopped. And what I'm going to want to do, so again, if you are in the lab computers, you shouldn't have to worry about that. What I'm going to do instead, or for anybody who can't render in the labs for some reason, or just as an alternative in case batch rendering doesn't work, is I'm going to go to render and then say render sequence. And I'm pretty much just going to leave everything default except make sure I'm rendering from the right camera. Otherwise, I'm kind of just going to leave everything blank because most of these settings don't apply to a simple thing like this. And I'll just say render sequence and close. And what this is going to do is it's going to be similar to a batch render, but it's going to render each one in real time in the viewport, or sorry, in the render window. And you're going to have to sit and watch. It's torturing you. So hopefully you won't have to do that, but just wanted to point that out, because if you do a regular batch render, then you won't see this. You'll just see progress text in your script editor, but you won't actually see images popping up. Anyway, I'm going to pause the video until I get to the After Effects part. So for you, it'll be a millisecond. For me, I might have to wait for a little bit here, but all right. Alright, so for me that was quite a long time between when I paused it and now. But basically I just jumped straight into After Effects, and I also have open Adobe Media Encoder. So this if you have After Effects, then this should also be installed by default. You might have to search for it, but you can also use Adobe Media Encoder if you'd like to use Premiere or something else for your video editing. Anyway, so if we want to work smarter and not harder, the thing that I would suggest doing is going to Edit, Preferences, and going to Import and making sure that you change your default frame rate to 24, because then you won't have to change it when you bring things in and they're at 30 or whatever. So I'm going to just hit OK, and then I'm basically, there's a few things you could do. You could double click over here to import your image sequence. Clearly I need to navigate to my folder before I do this. So all of your renders should be in your images folder with whatever naming convention that you gave them. And if you didn't give them one, then it will just default to your scene file name. And you need to make sure to have this checked on. It says Open EXR Sequence, assuming that you did as an EXR. You can import. You could also just hit that thing that says New Composition from Footage, and that could make you a composition right away without having to make one yourself. But if you check over here, you'll see that these are 24 frame rate, 24 frames per second. So we are safe. And if you hit spacebar, it'll cache a preview of your animation, and you can kind of see what it looks like before you actually render it out. It will take a little while to run through the first time, but then the second time you should play at normal speed, assuming that your computer has enough RAM, of course. And so there's my turntable. And now, obviously, I don't want to keep a blank, transparent background, because, first of all, that won't even be transparent when I render out an MP4, so it will just be black. And plus, I want this to be a little bit stylized. So here's two things you can do. One is that you just bring in an image. So you could bring in pretty much any. You could bring in a render. So here's an old render that I had from another class. It has a V-Ray watermark on it. But I could bring in a render. I could bring in just a picture, something that makes sense for, you know, just the scene that you're making. And here, if I like make my thing a little bit smaller, I might go over to my effects and presets. Now I'm in my own custom workspace, so maybe I'll change it back to default. In which case, I might have to find effects and presets over here and type in blur to narrow it down, and then look for just Gaussian blur. Camera lens blur or Gaussian blur should be fine. We can put a blur on that and change the blurriness of my background image so it's not as crazily obvious. And maybe I'd even put type in hue and then look for hue saturation. Maybe I'll even turn down the saturation of that background image a little bit. Now, even this might be a little bit too distracting, so don't just go with the first thing that you find. You could also try putting in, you know, whatever image you're using for your HDR, but just remember that that's designed to be on a dome or on a sphere, so it might not fit in automatically. So, you know, I might play around with this some more, but I'm not going to do it in the video because that'd be pretty boring to watch me just art direct my turntable in real time. That'd be a little bit boring to watch. So you can put that there, and oh, I said I was going to show you another thing. Here's another idea if you don't want to put a picture. I'm going to go Layer, New, Solid, and I'll create myself a solid. You could, you know, pick a color right off the bat if you want, but we're kind of going to ignore that. I'll rearrange these layers so that's underneath. And instead, I'm going to look for gradient ramp and put that onto my solid. And you can see here that much like the ramp in AfterEffects, or sorry, in Photoshop, Maya, the ramp in Maya, we can, you know, we have these two different points of start and end point. You can swap the colors. You can choose what kind of ramp it actually is, so radial or linear. And you can put in your own colors, so pick something, you know, probably if we're using design theory here, put something a little bit darker on the bottom and a little bit lighter on the top. Obviously, you can decide for yourself what exactly you want it to look like, but here I can kind of just use that to give myself a kind of pleasing but still not intrusive looking background color to my render. And since this is just one solid, it's not really going to impact how big your render file or anything is. So you can do one of those two things, but it's better to have a still background is the moral of the story. Maybe I could even, here's something fun I could do. Maybe I'll set this to like multiply or like overlay or something. And maybe I'll even blur this more. I said I wasn't going to get carried away, but here I am. So you could even like stack your ramp on top of your that doesn't really work on top of your background image and make it even harder to see. I'm just playing around with the screening modes here, blend modes. That actually looks pretty cool. Maybe I'll keep that. Whatever, because the next thing that we want to do is render. Now, here's my tip. I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. Instead of just saying composition, add to render queue and rendering it directly out of After Effects, which of course, you know, you'd have to change this to an MP4 and blah, blah, blah. What I'm actually going to do instead, and the reason I had Adobe Media Encoder open in the first place, is I am going to just say composition, add to media, Adobe Media Encoder queue. And here it is, and I want to make sure this is on H.264, which seems like it's not the correct thing, but that is actually what's going to give you a good low file size but good quality MP4 file. And you can actually see over here what the file extension is going to be. So I'm going to, you could probably just set this to like match source high bitrate, or if you have a newer version of this, some of these things are a little bit new, like, or you could even set it to like YouTube 720 HD or Vimeo 720 HD or whatever, in order to use that as your base plate. Basically, if you want to change the settings on this, and also to see a preview of how big your file is going to be, you can just click the text. Sometimes this takes, because it is coming directly from After Effects. We don't need audio, but yeah, right now this is going to be 11 megabytes. So I might scroll down here and lower my target bit rate a little bit, and you can get away with making this fairly low. You know, even if I just make it 5, now this is only going to be 5 megabytes. 11 megabytes isn't even that big in the first place, so it's not a big deal. But you want to get, you know, become a little knowledgeable about how, you know, test these things out in your spare time to make sure that you know what to do if you're sending this to a client or somebody who is going to be watching it on their phone and has to download it really quickly, and maybe not over Wi-Fi or something like that. And you want to make sure that this goes somewhere, because right now mine's going to like the After Effects folder on my computer rather than in the scene file. So I'll just put this in movies, and I'll just call this, you know, Regan week 08 turntable, and that'll be .mp4. And then you can just hit the green arrow, and that's going to blast through and be super quick. And now this is only 5.96 megabytes, and it looks fairly decent. Obviously, this is also a lower resolution. Actually, funny thing that I didn't mention when I unpaused my video, I was rendering this at higher settings, and then halfway through I canceled the render and rendered the rest with lower settings because it was taking too long. So there is a subtle drop in quality halfway through this little example video. But yeah, so that's all you should need to make a turntable and to get it running in After Effects, and it should be a perfect loop because you will have set it up that way by rendering one less frame than the actual animation. There's a little jump, of course, because of the program, but that is not our fault. That is the program's fault. Alright, so that's all for this video. I know it ended up kind of long anyway, but there's a bunch of stuff to talk about in this world of rendering and whatnot. So that is going to be it, and I will see you guys next time.